Good evening from the International House of Japan. It's 6 p.m. here in Tokyo. Welcome to the third session of our series, Leaders Shaping the Future of the Indo-Pacific. My name is James KONDO, Chairman of the Board of the International House of Japan. The topic of today's session is technology and geopolitics in Asia. And we couldn't have a better speaker today than Parag Khanna. Parag was born in India, grew up in UAE, moved to the United States, obtained his bachelor's and master's degree from Columbia University and a PhD from London School of Economics. He has worked at the World Economic Forum, the Council of Foreign Relations, Brookings Institution, New America Foundation, and National University of Singapore. He has also served as an advisor to U.S. Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as U.S. National Intelligence Council. Parag is also a best-selling author of several books on the emerging world order, technology, and governance models. His most recent book, The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century, is considered a must-read for everyone who seeks to understand the forces underlying the rise of Asia and what it means for the world. Parag has been named one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century by the Esquire magazine and a foreign policy whiz-kid by the New York Times Book Review. Parag, we are delighted to have you for this session. Thank you for joining us. Are we losing?
So good to see you, James. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Great. Well, it's been a long time, and you must have, for someone who's traveled to 150 countries, I hear, it must be the first time in your life, maybe, that you haven't flown in about a year.
That's exactly right. It is strange. I mean, I think, of course, living in Singapore, we have to consider ourselves fortunate that we have can more or less maintain our usual routine and quality of life. So we're very grateful for that. But it is, ironically, this one little country of Singapore does have the world's highest per capita aviation emissions, because to go anywhere, you do have to fly. So it has been a very big adjustment for the, at least I would say, maybe roughly 1 million people here who are accustomed to getting on and off planes every single week.
Well, Parag, I think we're going to definitely touch on the topic of Singapore and its governance as we dive into the discussion. But I want to start and set the frame about this discussion of Asia by asking you, how do you define Asia? What's the breadth? What's the scope?
It's a great question. And, one of the reasons I wrote this book is precisely because over the last 20 years or so, there has been a growing literature about Asia, but it's tended to be quite China-centric, or it's been a sort of US-centric, kind of US policy towards Asia. But it hasn't been sufficiently geographic. And if we're going to take a definition of Asia, it should be a geographic definition. So when you ask me what is my definition, I want to be clear. I do not have a definition. I am not entitled to a definition, and nor are you, and nor is anyone. There is a geographical definition of Asia, and that is the one that we should use. And that definition has not changed. It has not changed in centuries. And the definition of Asia stretches all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and to the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Caucasus, Turkey, Iran, South Asia, even most of Russia, Central Asia, all the way to, of course, Japan is Asia, as is, from a kind of standpoint of adjacent continental or hemispheric zones, from Russia to Australia. That is Asia. And again, I don't think that should be subject to any debate. And particularly the last 30 years, we have seen that this broader Asian zone is coming closer and closer together. And that's why I wanted to tell this story about what I call the Asian system. And it is a system that really does include all of those corners of Asian geography that have been neglected in much of the thinking and writing about Asia in the last couple of decades.
So Parag, that's very helpful. It's also a very broad definition, the geographic definition that's historical that you're describing. You touched on the connection with that broad region. Do you find that geographic breadth that's very broad relevant and meaningful as we think about the future?
Oh, it's more relevant than ever, quite frankly. No one alive today can remember the last time when the countries of Asia, the civilizations of Asia, had more intense relations with each other than with colonial powers or Cold War superpowers, because that time was 500 years ago. And so we are experiencing a momentous return of this historical paradigm in which Asia is becoming ever more an interdependent and integrated system. So how could it possibly be more important than it is today to have to use and leverage this proper understanding of Asia to see that all of its components, all of its subregions are connecting more to each other and are rising together, because that is exactly the story of the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what I like to remind people is that the defining characteristic when we look back 100 years from now of the post-Cold War era is not the rise of China, it's the rise of Asia. And China is one very important pillar of Asia, of that Asian system, but it is a much bigger story than China alone.
So Parag, in your book, to your point, you talk about three phases of growth of Asia. The first one starting in 1950s with Japan and Korea, the second phase with Greater China, and then China, which is where much of the debate is today. But you'll point out that we're actually in the midst of the third growth phase. Can you talk about that third phase that we're in?
Right, this next wave of Asian growth could very well surpass, in the medium term, long term, what the third wave or what the previous wave has delivered. And that is because the countries of South and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan through India, through all of ASEAN, they represent 2.5 billion people. So they represent more than half the total Asian population, has yet to fully and properly emerge. These countries are all very young in population. Their median age is anywhere from 10 to 15 years younger than China, and about 25 years younger in median age than Japan, with the sole exception of Thailand, which actually has a relatively high median age. But largely, these are very young populations. They are urbanizing, they are digitizing, they are leapfrogging, they're embracing technology. Their economies are becoming services-driven economies, not just based on manufacturing sector and so forth. So there's an enormous potential in this next wave of growth of these 2.5 billion people. And again, that is why when we look back several decades from now, we will see that Asia's collective rise was the really big story. And let's remember that whereas many people who talk about global political economy speak about rival national blocs, Japan versus China versus India and so forth, this story of the last 75 years that begins with the Japanese economic miracle is actually the story of mutually reinforcing waves. Japan's modernization and industrialization is what inspired the tiger economies. And China was inspired by Japan and the tigers. And now Japan and the tigers and China are the largest investors and trading partners of this next wave of young, fast-growing, highly populous Asian economies. So again, it is a collective system that is mutually reinforcing.
Well, Parag, I think one of the things that I found very, very exciting in reading your book, for many of us who are now obsessed with the rise of China, the second phase, is your point, as you stated, that the population involved in the third phase is actually 2.5 times larger than the Chinese population, which is quite large, but also younger. And so I think the growth momentum that we can foresee should be very large and should be the future that we should be eyeing and talking about.
That's exactly right. And, I don't fault people for being caught up in the moment, right? China is the talk of the town, so to speak, and has been for a decade. And China is a superpower and will remain a superpower, just like America will remain a superpower. However, what we have to understand is that this is a unique moment in history. Not only is the world multipolar, with the United States, the European Union, and China as global superpowers, but Asia itself is multipolar, with Japan, China, India, and other powers, not of equal weight or power or significance, but certainly creating an Asian system that is very diffuse in its power rather than entirely concentrated. And that is something that people have a very hard time understanding.
Well, I think we have many viewers today from around Asia, but also from the United States and Europe. What I find very interesting is that in our divided world today, if we look at the US political debate, for example, the view that China is a hegemonic rival seems to be one of the very few areas that the Republicans and Democrats can agree on. Are we heading towards a US-China hegemonic contest as we move from phase 2 of Asianization to phase 3, as you describe it?
I don't believe we are, and I think that it's yet another very common, but it's such a weighty misperception that it deserves to be investigated very closely. So let's remember that when the United States became the world's sole superpower at the end of World War II, it represented 50% of global GDP. So the foundations of American strategic power were absolutely enormous, unsurpassed, like nothing in the history of humanity. China becoming a superpower is literally, from a statistical standpoint, not a very big deal. China represents less than 15%, that's 1.5% of global GDP. And yes, its economy is growing, but it also is decelerating. We also have many other $1 trillion or $5 trillion economies, and of course, multiple 10 to 15 or $20 trillion economies, such as the United States and the European Union. So it's really a multipolar world economically and strategically. Now, a second point that needs to be made is that in order to be a global superpower, which is certainly what China aspires to be, you would, at a minimum, have to utterly dominate your own neighborhood, right? Let's think about America in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and its ability to have uncontested hegemony over the entire Western Hemisphere. Stability in your own neighborhood is a prerequisite to being able to project power globally. That is not something that China can do. It's not something that China can do because Asia is not the Western Hemisphere. There are numerous, as we just discussed, great deep powers and civilizations. They are nuclear powers. They have large populations. India's population is effectively now the same size as China's and will soon be larger. And again, with the economic resources and growing military potential to dampen or limit Chinese expansionism. So I'm very clear in my view that I do not believe that China will even unilaterally dominate all of Asia, let alone the entire world, with the United States, Europe, and other Asian powers, certainly more focused than they have been in the last 10 plus years to ensure that that is not the case. So I think it's always been a big mistake to portray China's rise as either A, equaling the decline of the United States or the West, because it doesn't require the decline of one to have the rise of another. You can have a stable multipolarity. And secondly, that this would be a linear pathway towards Chinese ascendance, because you have reactions to the actions. And again, people have been living in the moment. One looks at the Belt and Road plans and assumes that they've already been implemented, as if the whole world has fallen down. But they haven't. What's actually happened in the last 3 years is an enormous and rapid awakening and the birth of entire new schemes to contrast, to challenge, to compete with Belt and Road. And I actually believe those forces will actually ultimately be more successful than Belt and Road itself.
So Parag, you make a very convincing and data-rich argument that these views, that the world is all about US-China rivalry, is a simplification. Why do you think that debate, that framing is so powerful? Why is it so pervasive, given everything that you said?
There's actually, by the way, it's an excellent question, because it allows us to get to the heart of some of the factors or intuitions and frameworks and mentalities that drive how we look at the world. The first is quite simply the dominance of the Anglo-American strain of the English language, and the, if you will, hegemony in a different sense of the term, the kind of intellectual hegemony that those perspectives have. Now, in Anglo-American international relations or strategic discourse, it's heavily colored by the experience of the Cold War. It believes in hegemonic cycles and hegemonic transitions, because that has been the recent history of Western power transitions. But that does not at all explain global power distribution. So using very narrow Eurocentric theories to explain the entire world is a very bad idea. That's why I devote significant portion of the early part of this book to look at the history of Asia, because the history of Asia doesn't tell us anything of the sort. The history of Asia, which is the history of most of humanity, tells us the story of a simultaneous multipolarity, of multi-civilizational balance, of equilibrium, and a kind of live and let live attitude between empires and societies. So I don't see why we should be using Western history at all to explain what is quite self-evidently an Asian century. We should look at Asian history. And the Asian template, if you will, is very different. There have been, I want to hasten to add, some scholars in the West who have actually been, very heroically responsible for elevating the voices of Japanese, Chinese, Indian, and Asian scholars into the Western discourse. They just make arguments and have a logic that's a bit more sophisticated than simply saying it's a new Cold War. And of course, that means that the second part of the answer to your question is the politics, not the language and the culture and the academic theories, but of course the politics of simplicity, right? Simply saying we just came out of a Cold War, we need a new rival, China is a rival, it's a G2 competition to carve up the world. That's very neat. But of course, as the famous economist Herb Simon said, things that sound, so neat and tidy are usually precisely that: neat, simple, and wrong.
Well, Parag, I think I would recommend for everyone who has not read Parag's book, The Future is Asian, the chapter that Parag talks about, which is the Pan-Asian history, is perhaps one of the most enlightening and actually interestingly fresh, even for an Asian reader, because I think we are so caught up in one, Western diplomatic history, but also I think the history of Asia that we learn is actually quite narrow. And so the 1,000-year span that you've laid out, plus the geographic breadth that you've detailed, is actually a fresh history that I think all of us need to be learning, and perhaps should be in the global and regional history that students should be learning across our region.
And much as Western scholars and academics can be forgiven for looking at the world through their own prism, the same is indeed true of Asia. We have a rich Japanese civilization and history, Chinese, Korean, Indian. Countries and students and societies in Asia, of course, do bias toward their own history as well. So the challenge that I put to myself was, how could I give an account of Asian history that all Asians would agree to, despite their contrasting and conflicting national histories? And it was an enormously painful exercise, I have to say, but I think it was worthwhile. But unlike other books I've written, my goal was very explicitly to help Asians understand Asia. I wanted a Filipino or an Indonesian or a Japanese or a Chinese or an Indian or a Kazakh or a Russian or an Iranian to read this and have the same reaction you did, to say, wait a minute, it's how can we even explain our own history without seeing the connectivity that we have had with each other over the past 4,000 years?
Well, Parag, shifting the debate to one of the things you've written extensively about, which is about governance. And you suggest in your book, but also in many articles, that technocracy is the future form of governance, or at least we should be looking at that form of governance as one of the models. Explain technocracy for us.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let me first say that the kind of ideal form of government that I've tried to sketch out, in a variety of writings is what I call direct technocracy. And the word direct comes from the Swiss model of direct democracy. So ultimately, what I'm trying to promote is what you might call a democratic technocracy. So I don't want to lose sight of the importance of a public consultation and citizen input and democratic processes. After all, as I emphasize, the foremost technocracies in the world are democracies as well. And that includes very much Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and even Singapore. So they are democracies to a greater or lesser degree. When it comes to full democracies, those of a higher rating and standing than even Western democracies, let's remember that that is where Japan stands. That is where South Korea and Taiwan stand. So let's not lose sight of the democratic element. But to clarify the point about technocracy, that is in no way anti-democratic. It is about the caliber of public institutions. It is about the state, not the government in the sense of which coalition is ruling at any given time, but rather what are the instruments, the institutions, the foundations, the civil service, the bureaucracy, how competent are they, how qualified are they, how trusted are they? And what you find in Japan and South Korea and Singapore and elsewhere is that the civil service is very highly regarded, very deeply trusted, very capable and competent to carry out and execute. And that's precisely, of course, what we've seen with this pandemic. So I think that if anything, this experience, this tragic global experience of the pandemic, has been a validation of the idea that, just being a democracy is not good enough. You could be a democracy like India, right, which is a tragic case in many, many respects. Or you can be a democratic technocracy. But ultimately, if you're focused on good governance, on public service delivery, on institutions, on capacity, you cannot avoid the issue of technocracy in addition to democracy.
So, Parag, you're now, after traveling throughout the world, living throughout the world, you're now based and for this moment stuck in Singapore, which is perhaps the world's best known technocracy. And many people are studying Singapore as one of the models, and it may be one of the idea and policy exports that Singapore has. We often hear this question, is the Singapore model, the way it's implemented, there's plenty to learn from it. How replicable do you think it is?
A lot of people have made the claim that large states cannot learn from small states. And I have a very, very simple and obvious rejoinder to that, which is China became China because it's been trying to copy Singapore for the last 40 years, right? It is very much the Singapore story that inspired Deng Xiaoping's reforms. So there's no question that China wants to become a collection of 40 or 50 Singapores commensurate with its size. So the notion that large states cannot learn from small states is refuted on its face. Secondly, in an age of digital governance, it's not really about the scale either. Whether you are digitizing 5 medical records or 5 million or 500 million medical records, data is free. It's just a matter of, scanning it and digitizing it. So again, there are many, many lessons. And I want to also emphasize that in terms of the Singapore model, sure, we are reading in the public domain, in the Western press, more and more people waking up to it. But, this is something that people who live in this country, and I have not lived in this country very long, but I've been writing about this country since well before I ever lived here. I have noticed that people have been paying attention to, especially in Asia, the Singapore model for about 20 years. About 20 years. It was about 15 years ago that I wrote in one article in the New York Times that the icon of 21st century governance for the entire developing world is Lee Kuan Yew, not Thomas Jefferson. And I had no polemical reason to say that as an American, backpacker and traveler as I was 15 years ago. I wrote it because that is what people were telling me. That is what people told me in Kazakhstan. That's what people told me in the Middle East. That's what people told me all around Southeast Asia. So what you and I have known for quite some time, James, may be new news to some people, but it's certainly not new in Asia. And it does come back to this point about technocracy, because Asians have been opening up to each other for 30 years. This is exactly the point at which we began the conversation. So for 30 years, Asians have been looking at each other and looking at Japan. Why can't we have high-speed railways like Japan? Why can't we have clean streets like Japan, law and order and safety and democracy and high-quality institutions like Japan? Why can't we have Singapore's civil service and impeccability and these kinds of things? We have been watching and learning from each other, and we shouldn't need to wait for people in other countries, thousands of kilometers from here, to realize that Asians are learning from each other, to celebrate that fact, because I think we understand each other's circumstances better. And you can see this in the case of some of the very large countries, Indonesia and the Philippines, that are struggling. We should have much more sympathy with the very painful, difficult initial conditions that these countries have. They're so large, sprawling islands, populous, poor, post-colonial, weak infrastructure. It surprises so many people in the West that a leader like Jokowi or Duterte, who comes across, who is rather illiberal, or Modi for that matter in India, that they would be so illiberal. How could people possibly tolerate them? And that shows a stunning lack of empathy, right? I think, you and I could have our criticisms about these leaders. I have many, 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 but I think as Asians, we can also put ourselves in the shoes of a common person in the Philippines or Indonesia or India and understand why. To state a fact, James, these are three of the most popular leaders on the planet Earth today in democratic societies. And if you, as an individual, as an observer, cannot understand why these leaders are popular, I don't think that you're qualified to comment on these countries.
Well, Parag, I think one of the most kind of forward-looking and I think exciting and interesting area that you discuss is the role that data can play to enhance technocracy. There is similar to the US-China debate. Often people have this kind of two approaches with regard to data. Either it is held by the public, and the less the government or corporations have anything to do with it, the more free we are, or we are in some sort of a data autocracy where the government typically uses data to completely subvert and control people. But I think you're saying that data used in the right way for the people by a technocratic government can actually learn from the public, but also use the technology to deploy at scale many things that were not possible before.
And there's very good examples of this. And again, they emerge from democracy, just to be clear. Japan conducts very widespread, public opinion surveys, online through social media and this kind of thing. In South Korea, especially in the city of Seoul, they have digital referenda. So people are really giving their views on policy through apps and so forth, straight from their phone. So this is digital democracy for sure. Now we see it with contact tracing and the apps and the trust that people have that these apps are, and the data that's being collected is being used for public benefit. In the West, people don't want to give up their data to the government, and they don't even want to get vaccinated. This is not a good or healthy psychological state of affairs. So I do think that governments, fortunately here in this region, most of them have earned that trust of their people, and they're using that trust for the benefit of the public. Again, we've seen it with Trace Together apps. We see it with these referenda around key social issues. And Singapore does a tremendous amount with this. Everyone knows that Singapore's elections are historically not the most competitive, but elections happen once every 5 years. This is a country that 365 days a year is canvassing and listening and interviewing and having focus groups with every possible constituency in many different languages to understand exactly what the people want, what is in their interest, what things are too expensive, what needs to be fixed, what are their social concerns, and to do things about them. And I think it's a huge mistake when we're talking about governance to only look at what happens in elections. Because the answer is, the more important question that we need to answer is the right policy, is the utilitarian policy that is in the best interest of the whole of society, is that policy being implemented or not? And that to me is a far more important question than whether there is one political party or 6 political parties. Again, I just want to state I'm a believer in multi-party parliamentary democracy, such as you have in Japan. This is one of the most widespread and certainly the most democratic and fair and inclusive political model that exists, is to have a multi-party parliamentary system, and that forces parties to build coalitions. Their feet are always held to the fire, and you can have frequent changes of government if there is a lack of confidence. And that is also borne out by all of our studies and research on what correlations we have between the type of regime and its responsiveness to the public. So I'm just being clear that I'm a believer that is the right way in which to conduct politics and to determine leadership, but it still does not guarantee. Remember, again, India is a multi-party parliamentary democracy, right? It does not guarantee good governance. You need both democracy and technocracy.
So, Parag, I think a broader point you're making through many of the examples that you're giving is that including the governance model, there are ideas, people, initiatives, systems that are being led and developed in Asia that is spreading around the world. And you term that kind of broad movement in your book Asianization, where we had Europeanization, Americanization, and now Asianization. When I think about Americanization, it had its own share of both fascination but tremendous resistance. How do you expect the rest of the world to accommodate Asianization?
Well, the interesting thing is actually the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have to or be pro or against Asianization, because this is just a very, and I don't mean this as some kind of a play on words or some kind of a cop-out, but when most of the human population is Asian, it only requires that Asians accept Asianization for Asianization to actually be the dominant norm in the world. So it really doesn't come down to whether or not the editor of The Economist or the Financial Times accepts the reality of Asianization. It's simply that Asia needs to become more Asian, and Asia is becoming more Asian. And that is not just my sentiment. What I try to do is to measure these propositions. So, for example, I set out to measure the volume of trade between Asian countries. Well, as you know, it's 60 to 65% of total Asian trade is within Asia. And that will only grow in light of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Then the volume of investment, the volume of travel and mobility of people. Most Asians travel within Asia. Now, of course, Asia is the largest provider of foreign students to Europe and America. But a far larger number of Asians never leave Asia to study or to travel or to work or to go on holiday. So we already live in an Asian Asia, and therefore we live in an Asian world. Now, I've tried to document to what extent other parts of the world are Asianizing. In other words, if you look at the size of diasporas, the volume of investment, the cultural influences, the demographic shifts, in America, this is abundantly clear. You now have a half Indian American vice president in the United States. You have a record number of Asian minorities in Congress and in various positions of leadership across the country, and so forth. Now, every region of the world is literally somewhere on the spectrum and moving along that spectrum towards greater Asianization. Right? It could be, again, the number of Asians, the trade with Asia, the investment from Asia, the deals with Asia, the cultural influences, and so forth. But in every one of those ways, it is happening. So there really isn't some kind of a single dominant orthodox viewpoint of the world that emerges from somewhere else in the world, like, say, New York City, where I'm from. And therefore, until one has convinced New York City to accept an Asian world, the world is not Asian. The world is Asian. In a way, I wanted to call the book "The Present is Asian" rather than the future, but that doesn't make for as clever sort of title. But yes, we do live, and I think again, you and I can more or less take it for granted. The question is really just again how long it takes others to adapt to it.
Wow. So we have many questions. I hope we can cover many of them. The first question is from Mr. Jaikmar Shahani, Chairman of Shahani Associates, co-organizer of Japan-India Distinguished Visitors Program with the International House of Japan. His question is, what are the synergies between Japan and India working together to help usher in progress, peace, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific? And how have they changed in the last year with the pandemic?
It's a very good question. Now, I want to point out that over the last 20 years that Japanese-Indian dialogue has deepened and the relationship has deepened. Japan and India deserve joint credit for promulgating this notion of an Indo-Pacific. And it is now the rest of the world that has adopted this terminology of the Indo-Pacific. And the United States has renamed an entire military command around this Indo-Pacific concept. So recognizing that organic unity and connectivity, that again is very deeply rooted in Asian history, is a real accomplishment of the Japanese-Indian intellectual partnership. As you know, in the book, I go back, a century and a half and look at some of those common intellectual strains of mutual inspiration, and I find it to be a very rewarding story. Now, today, Japan is one of the largest investors in India. It has really taken big bets on India and trying to sponsor its technological modernization, doing large infrastructure projects, working with Indian companies, and so forth. And I think that's been, a fruitful process, one that India has very much needed in order to see what it takes, the discipline that it takes, and the innovation that it takes to be a broad-based, high-tech society. So I do think that Japan continues to be a significant inspiration. From the Japanese side, of course, it's important to discover those markets where one can have make a significant mark and have a major export revenue. As frustrating as I know that it is to navigate the democracy and the bureaucracy simultaneously of India, but I do think there's a very long way to go in that relationship in a good way. There's many things that they will still accomplish together commercially and perhaps even strategically when we think about the framework of the so-called Quad, the Quad initiative of the US, Japan, Australia, and India.
Parag, so thank you. Second question is from Marites Vitug, editor-at-large at Rappler and author from the Philippines, fellow of Asia Leadership Fellow Program at the International House of Japan. The question is, the pandemic has laid out a paradox. It has cut off international mobility, yet made global cooperation urgent. What lessons can Asia draw in building coalitions and alliances?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. And yes, it has temporarily cut off international mobility, of course, for a very good reason. And indeed, we perhaps should have cut off mobility more and for longer. And if we had, we might have defeated this pandemic much better than we appear to be coping with it right now. And it, of course, at the same time, elevates the need for international cooperation, whether it's vaccine diplomacy, whether it is food diplomacy. We've seen that our food trade has been cut off, trade in essential goods and so forth has been restricted. And so I think coming out of this, we will have to help each other become more self-sufficient. So that may seem a bit ironic, right? We need to promote cooperation so that countries can be more self-sufficient, so that they can grow more of their own food, so they're not dependent on imports when there is a disruption such as this. But that itself is something that we should be doing in the interests of environmental sustainability. One of the areas where Asian cooperation is the weakest is actually in environmental issues. We now have trade agreements, investment agreements, financial flows, and all of these positive phenomena in Asia, but we don't have an environmental governance framework. And I think that's direly lacking, because there are powers such as Japan that are leaders in nuclear, hydrogen, and so many other technologies, solar coming out of China, and so forth. We need to have a major initiative to export, subsidize, promote the transfer of these technologies from high-tech Asia to low-tech Asia, from very hyper-modern Asia to industrializing Asia. And that's going to be the critical element in helping these countries sustainably modernize in the coming 10 or 15 years. It's an enormous economic opportunity. It's also a moral responsibility at the same time. And it's definitely a big gap in Asian governance. And of course, you and I know very well, James, No one is going to do this for us Asians, right? Asia needs to do this itself. It is on the scale of the Belt and Road Initiative, Asian countries need to get together and say, we need an Asian environmental accord. And it's everything from China sorting out the water rights issues with downstream countries of the Mekong to these technology transfers around electric vehicles and so forth.
The next question is from Imtiaz Gul, who is Executive Director, Center for Research and Security Studies from Pakistan, another Asia Leadership Fellow. Can we really hope for a peaceful, progressing Asia in a situation in which the US is leaning on India as a counterweight to China in the region? Doesn't geopolitics make the pursuit of peace and access to technology a very subjective matter, mostly to the disadvantage of smaller countries like Pakistan, who are treated as China allies and thus made to suffer?
It's an excellent question. It's very complex dynamic. Again, I believe in the principle of multipolarity globally and within Asia. That has very much been the norm in Asia. And having an Asian equilibrium of a mutual respect among Asian powers is very much the goal that we should all share. And that is whether it's greater or lesser powers, larger or smaller states. And I think we all need to not only say that, we need to believe it and act accordingly. Well, if we are acting accordingly, it does mean that countries such as India or Indonesia or Vietnam need to stand up for themselves in terms of protecting the sovereignty of their borders, for example. It doesn't mean that smaller states need to suffer. Let's remember that starting with Japanese leadership in the 1990s on infrastructure lending and infrastructure finance, and now with the Belt and Road, there's an enormous amount of support that's been given for the developing countries of Asia to elevate, to modernize, to use that infrastructure as a platform to generate what is called a multiplier effect for their growth. And Pakistan or Indonesia, Thailand, these countries have enormous potential that is, to some degree, finally being reached or achieved because of the investment that is coming from other Asians. So I do think that it's not a zero-sum game. Yes, there are geostrategic maneuvers to maintain that multipolarity in Asia. And it is precisely the maintenance of that stability that is going to allow smaller countries to actually grow, to receive. No one is going to invest in an unstable area. Only if Asia remains stable are the poorer countries going to receive the investment that they actually need to finance their long-term growth. So it's imperative that we view these two issues as connected to each other and not in a zero-sum formulation, because in fact, they should positively reinforce each other.
Next question from Jun Mukoyama, a fellow of Asia-Pacific Initiative, Nitobe Leadership Fellow at the International House of Japan. You make a provocative point in The Future is Asian that people are becoming more open to effective non-democracies rather than corrupt and inept democracies. Handling of the pandemic in China and Singapore versus the countries in the West may have reinforced such views. How do you think the pandemic will affect this global debate going forward?
Well, we touched on this earlier, but I think that the way the question is phrased raises some very important points to add on. The first is that the delegitimation, if you will, of the kind of Anglo-American political style of populist executive governance has been underway for at least 2 decades. And if we think about the bumbling way in which the US conducted the invasion of Iraq, and all the way through the financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street into Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, right? So we actually have almost 2 decades of experience in witnessing this particular axis of leadership in terms of our ideological and political discourse more or less failing, basically living on borrowed time, and demonstrating its distinct lack of resilience in the face of matters such as the pandemic. Now, I'm saying this to make absolutely clear that this delegitimation was well underway before the pandemic. Because as you know, James, it's very common for people to say, oh, well, this will be the event that leads to a reckoning intellectually, about Western order and Western political systems, and then every few years there's an episode like this, and people believe that will be the milestone. That is not true. It is an ever unfolding process. We have, and you and I are both relatively young. We can remember the last 25 years of these failures and errors and mistakes. So as far as I'm concerned, even without the pandemic, we would be having this conversation about how Asian democratic technocracy is a superior form of governance, right? And we need to ensure that people do not lose sight of that reality when the pandemic goes away, because this has been the case, and it's been more and more something that we can document over 20 years, not just the last 12 months. But the pandemic will, of course, accelerate it in the ways that we discussed. There will be a recognition that this category of state has done a better job in managing the pandemic, and wise countries will be those who will learn from the experience. And wise countries in general don't care whether the lesson comes from Asia or from the West, from North or from South. They look at good policies and bad policies, and they take the good policies and see if those policies are better than their policies. And if they are better, how can they adapt them to their own system? That is the objective and, dare I say, technocratic way to approach policy challenges. And I want to be, just to circle back to the first point, this is not about the West as a whole. The West is full of absolutely exemplary governments, whether it is Canada, whether it is Denmark, or even, again, to take a very large country, Germany, a country that I've lived in numerous times, a place where I'm very much at home and I've studied very closely. Germany is a very large country. It has 80 million people. And it's a Western. Now, Germany is not run anything like the United States, or I should say the United States is not run anything like Germany. But Germany is very much a democratic technocracy. It is the largest Western democratic technocracy, an extremely well-run country, and again, a multi-party parliamentary system. So it's highly democratic and highly technocratic at the same time. So I want to be clear that we should really never generalize about the West. We can't even do so as a strategic community anymore, and we certainly can't as a political community, because that would do a great disservice to those European countries that are governed very, very well.
So Parag, we have many questions from the audience joining us. So let me try to pick a few of them before our time is up. So one of the things you mentioned in Future is Asian is about the size of the armed forces investments in Asia. It's actually combined as big as the United States and much larger than Europe. The question asked whether you think there will ever be a unified military force of Asia, or different forces combining different countries out of Asia.
Oh, that's a relatively easy one to answer. It's no. We will not have an Asian supranationalism, sort of like the European supranationalism. Again, this is a very different geography and cultural history. We have a half dozen major, distinct, discrete, proud, independent civilizations in Asia. It's not like Europe, which is basically one civilization in many ways. Of course, there's deep religious and cultural nuances, but there's nothing like the diversity of Asia in other parts of the world, other than Africa, actually. So Asia is not going to unite even as Asia comes together. And I think that's perfectly fine. And again, that is the Asian norm. It matters more to understand where Asia is evolving on Asian terms. So I don't believe in any kind of sort of, Asian unity per se, but I would like to see, and I do see, and I've tried to document perhaps more anecdotally than anything else, that I see a young generation of Asians that do feel themselves to be more naturally Asian. Of course, they will first and foremost identify as Indian or Japanese or Chinese. There's no question about it. But is there a sense that they have a kinship and something in common amongst members of their own generation across these boundaries because of their what they have come to learn about the historical interpenetration, because of the openness that our Asian societies do have to each other and the travels that are enabled, learning each other's languages, and these kinds of things. Again, intermarrying, living in each other's cities. all of these phenomena are very much on a massive upward slope right now in Asia. So I do think that Asian identity is returning, not in the, again, if you look at Europe, again, such a simpler model, even there it's very, very difficult to convince people to say that they are first and foremost European, right? No German or French person or Italian person says that. So the bar should not be set so impossibly high. The question is simply, do Asians increasingly appreciate that there is a common type of identity and preference, and then amity even across societies? Now, geopolitically, no, that does not exist. I'm not naive about what the public opinion surveys in Japan say about China. But again, that's geopolitics, right? And it's certainly very, very important. But there are other ways in which we form, relationships across boundaries, and we don't judge each other only by our political relations.
Another question coming in live from the live stream that we have. Is there any vision or expectation for a rise of pan-Asian currency?
So this is a very interesting one, and this is one where we can see a certain degree of convergence. So Asian economies, for example, have converged on matters such as interest rates, right? And trading of currencies within certain relatively controlled band. They're holding more of each other's reserves. They're certainly, again, as mentioned before, trading much more with each other than with the rest of the world. So there is a convergence, not just towards China and the RMB, but rather just within a sort of basket of Asian currencies. And I do think that that's a healthy trend that's bringing about a fair bit of stability in the Asian financial order. There's also the possibility of some kind of digitization or digital leapfrog in this process, where you could imagine something of a cryptocurrency, a stable coin, a sort of pan-Asian sovereign coin, to which currencies peg themselves, but is not controlled by one particular national central bank. And I would love to see Asians embrace this as a next step. Again, in the same way that environmental governance is a priority that would benefit all Asians, similarly, having a common platform and precisely this question would also be, a huge boost, really, to the liquidity and fluidity of transactions within Asia. And I think it's the kind of thing that I would love to see, Japan prioritize both of these areas, because Japan is such a leader and has such experience in the central bank and so forth. So these are some of the things that I'd like to see Japan and Singapore and China and other countries work together on. Perfect.
Next question. We talked a lot about the world being very, very focused on China. Many people are obviously looking at India. What country do you think is the most underappreciated but actually important country that keen observers should be studying right now?
Well, you didn't mention Japan in your question, but I'll assume that we tend to take Japan for granted, interestingly enough. I think you and I can reflect from the distant outside about this. When people look at Asia, they say, well, it's all about China, and India is stepping up, but it's slow. And then we neglect, we take Japan for granted. But I obviously do not take Japan for granted. So I do think that it's it's the original, if you will, pillar of modern Asia. It's still the iconic, large, modern power in Asia. No question. It's from a quote unquote soft power standpoint, as you know, it's certainly the most respected country in Asia, and is certainly one of the largest capital investors across all of Asia. So one should never minimize those contributions. So besides China, Japan, and India, the lesser powers are stepping into the spotlight more and more. And to take two examples, we could talk about Indonesia and the Philippines, or Vietnam rather. Let's take three. But just mentioning Indonesia first. Indonesia is also, like India, been talked about as a country that's always emerging but never quite makes it. But we're starting to see an alignment of the stars late in Jokowi's administration, where he has the political forces aligned and they're undertaking pretty significant reforms. Vietnam is obviously an incredible story of very rapid growth, absorbing the world's desire to shift supply chains to low-cost production centers, to shift out of China, to be open to trade agreements in all directions, to be one of the most trade-dependent countries in the world in terms of its trade to GDP ratio. So I do think it's an amazing story. And in Vietnam, you also see how they're trying very hard to build infrastructure to keep pace with demand. You know, in a city like Ho Chi Minh City, whose a greater metropolitan population is 20 plus million people, you don't get the feeling that you are in an ungovernable mega city the way you sometimes feel in parts of a city like Jakarta. So I think that Vietnam is deservedly getting more and more attention as well.
Great, thank you. Maybe this may be the final question from the audience. One of the things you're very good at is scenario planning, and the question relates to how the world is becoming more unpredictable with the pandemic and the breadth and the depth of its impact maybe being the most pertinent example everyone is currently feeling. How can, whether this is firms or governments, be future-minded and take scenarios into consideration when the world is so unpredictable?
It's a great question. This is why we make scenarios in the first place, precisely because we don't know what shock is going to hit us next. And a prepared and resilient society or government is one that prepares for all of eventualities and scenarios and is able to respond rapidly depending on which one does wind up striking. And so part of it is really embedding it in governments and companies, in educating society, and preparing, obviously, in terms of the stock of sovereign funds or reserves that a government has, so that it can pay for solutions. Obviously, stocking up on medical equipment, PPE equipment, and so forth is another good move. One of the things that a country like Singapore is doing right now, which is dependent on imports for almost all of our food supply, is that it's massively increasing and accelerating its investment in hydroponic and aquaponic food production. And therefore, it actually aims to produce 30% of its food consumption of staple crops within the next 5 years, coming from domestic sources. Now, let's remember, this is absolutely one of the smallest countries on the planet, and it's heavily urbanized. So this is an enormous investment in a technological undertaking. I do think that one of the growth areas coming out of the pandemic is going to be this agricultural resilience and self-sufficiency. So, positing scenarios that seem unrealistic, but preparing for them anyway, devoting resources to respond, again, educating the public to not belittle or diminish these risks. All of these are essential. And in Singapore, they call it the whole of nation approach. And, it requires a fair bit of sacrifice and appreciation of collective duty, trust in government, that the government works hard to earn that trust. So I think that there are, in fact, steps that can be taken. And now, again, coming out of the pandemic, there will be two kinds of countries: those that learn, from the best practices of others, and those that sadly ignore them.
Well, Parag, it's been a privilege. Thank you so much. We learned so much, and may we meet in person hopefully soon. And really, on behalf of all the audience, thank you so much.
Thank you, James. It was a great conversation.
For me, there were many observations and learnings from the conversation with Parag. I'll just mention three key themes that I think is very important. The first one is really a reminder for all of us that while the rise of China has been spectacular and significant and will remain so, we're in the midst of the next phase of growth of Asia that would be larger and potentially have bigger repercussions around the world. The second one is about governance, where we're seeing the rise of technocratic governance in many Asian countries now powered by data. And it will compete as a model with some traditional notions that we have of democracies that are focused on the procedures and the system itself. The third one is about Asianization, and Parag has made, I think, a very compelling case that Asian thought leaders and institutions have an important role to play to help shape and contribute to the global debate. And that's precisely the reason we're organizing this series for leaders shaping the Indo-Pacific to shed a spotlight on people and ideas and initiatives that are shaping the Indo-Pacific, but also the world. In closing, I would like to thank our co-organizers and sponsors, without whom this series would not be possible. Shahani Associates, Asia Society Japan Center, Mitsubishi UFJ Research and Consulting, the Japan Foundation Asia Center, MRA Foundation, Tanaka UK Japan Educational Foundation. Thank you so much for your support. Our next session will be next Friday at the same time. The topic will be Future of Architecture in Asia with So Fujimoto and Mun Sum Wong. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.